When it comes to superheroes, Marvel is definitely dominating the big screen with titles like Infinity War, Endgame coming out, and a whole slew of movies. But the small screen, I gotta give that to DC with CW's Arrowverse. But it still has a few problems. Hello, my name is Gabe, and to be honest, I love the Arrowverse, but I still see a few problems with it. Like anything. So I figured with the Arrowverse's flagship show, Arrow, announcing its impending ending, I figured now would be the best time to start going over them. Now first off, disclaimer, these are my opinions, blah blah blah. A few rules that should be noted before we get into this video. I'm not going to be talking about the current seasons of any of the shows. And for various reasons, mainly of which they're not over yet, and you really shouldn't judge something until it is. For the benefit of anyone watching, please extend the same courtesy in the comments. I'm not going to be talking about every single mistake the Arrowverse has made. That's just not feasible. Just the ones I think are worth talking about in bigger detail. I'm going to try my best to say how I think these shows could have done it better. Just something I want to try and do. Where to start? Oh, I know. Now, the Arrowverse, as well as a lot of shows, follow a specific structure in which a big bad is introduced at the beginning of the season, and the entire season is dedicated to stopping that big bad. I don't personally think there's a problem with that formula, but that's not to say the Arrowverse has used it perfectly every time. In fact, half the time they really mess it up with horrible season villains for one reason or another, and that's what I want to talk about today. Let's flash back to the first season of The Flash and talk about Harrison Wells, because there's something he does that is key. Now, I don't think Harrison Wells was a bad villain. That's exactly why we're talking about him, in fact. Half the viewers had already guessed who he was. The other half already knew something was up with him. Despite this, I think the Reverse Flash was one of the best villains they had on the show. And we need to talk about why. Number one, the Reverse Flash was the only villain. So obviously, finding out his identity is essential to the hero's goals. Number two, despite Harrison Wells being the Reverse Flash, a lot of what we see as his personality is his real personality, not a fake lie made up to make him seem appealing to the heroes. Him being the villain also didn't come out of nowhere, and we already knew he was the Reverse Flash for quite some time, as the reveal came after the mid-season finale for us. This meant we got to spend time knowing who the villain was and actually learning about the villain. We're going to talk more about that later. I'm using him because I think the Reverse Flash is the best villain to use as an example to cover how to build up a masked villain. Because Arrow and the Flash have messed it up quite a few times. We're going to talk about... Let's start with Zoom, or Hunter Zolomon. Number one, throughout the entirety of Season 2 of The Flash, we are introduced to Jay Garrick, an alternate universe Flash who is chasing Zoom. Except he turns out to be Zoom. His name isn't really Jay Garrick, it's Hunter Zolomon. Why do I bring this up? Because it kind of comes out of nowhere, and really hurts the season. Yes, we have a shot of him carrying himself, which could have meant a lot of things. But the big problem was, we never get to see who Hunter Zolomon is until, like, the very last episode. Until then, we're kind of clueless. And that ruins the character and the reveal. And the same is true of a villain in Arrow, Prometheus. Prometheus turns out to be Adrian Chase, who the show up to that point tried to convince us was Vigilante. The big problem with that is, once again, we don't really get a good idea of who Prometheus is. But these two villains aren't a sign of the worst thing. No, the worst thing they've done is mid-season villain shifts, which Prometheus, I guess, was also a victim to, but I'm going to talk about two villains, specifically. But first, I'll talk about the Flash's mistake. Savitar. Now, in Season 3 of The Flash, we were up to this point convinced that the villain was Dr. Alchemy, who was, by the way, an interesting villain. Someone who, using Barry's mistake, gave people powers from an alternate timeline. That in itself was kind of cool and actually really worked. Shame they kind of just dropped him after Savitar was revealed. Savitar, whose identity we never find out until like the last 2 or 3 episodes, turns out to be Barry Allen from the future, or a clone of Barry Allen from the future. It gets weird. But we never get to see this until the end of the show. So Savitar just kind of ends up being a blank slate. And that just never fixes itself. But I think the Arrowverse's worst committing this crime was actually last season, with the dragon. See, up until this point of the mid-season, the villain was Caden James, with a team of cronies doing stuff to try and hinder Team Arrow. And it was working. Now eventually, Team Arrow, in the mid-season, Team Arrow catches Caden James. And then it turns out this guy who said like 2 lines throughout the entire show up to this point was the true mastermind. The problem? He's boring. We don't have enough episodes to try and flesh him out, and the show does not do a good enough job to flesh him out. Which meant this mid-season villain shift kind of ruins itself. And the dragon just makes the later half of what was up to that point a really good season drag on and drag on and drag on. See what I'm doing there? Although, and the least of which problem is, they don't even defeat him in that season. Now, do I think they've done better with the dragon in the recent season? I can't answer that without breaking my rule, remember? So I just won't. And there's the problem. The Arrowverse had a history of kind of giving us some subpar big bads. Villains that just kind of are there with no real personality and no motivation. Note that whilst it's true these villains do exist, there have also been some really good ones. But that does not forgive the fact that the bad ones are still really bad. Now, I think the key to an effective villain doesn't always have to be a mystery. We could have a good villain. We should know who the villains are, or at the very least their personality. As those villains have tended, the ones we've known from the beginning have tended to be the best. Even if the teams that are fighting them don't know who the villains are. And that's really it. I feel keeping it a secret just hurts the show. And honestly, it's going on a little bit longer than I'd like it to, so I'll save the rest for another video. I'll try and get that out in a week or 2, but if you want to see when it comes out and be notified, you should subscribe. We also have a bunch of other stuff on the channel that might be worth checking out. If you like this video, give it a like, and anything you want to say it. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good night.